I had spent years wanting to escape the constant noise of city life, the endless traffic, the streetlights that never truly went out, and the crowd of strangers whose faces blurred together until they all looked the same. I had been working long shifts at a warehouse, my body aching more each day, and my mind drained by the monotony of routines I didn't care about anymore. So when I finally found an old cabin listed online, miles away from any sign of civilization, I didn't hesitate. It was 1997, and I was 29, living alone and desperate for a break. The cabin was tucked deep in the mountains of western Montana, near a river I would soon find out was far less friendly than it looked in the pictures. The cabin itself was modest, built of thick logs that had darkened with age, set on a slope with a small clearing around it. The surrounding trees were dense, towering pines and firs that blocked the sun much of the day, leaving the forest floor covered in a constant shadow. When I arrived, the air smelled like wet earth and decaying leaves. The river nearby gurgled through rocks I couldn't see from the path, adding a constant background noise that was both soothing and unnerving. I had driven hours through winding mountain roads, the kind that demanded full attention, and by the time I got there, my hands were cramped and my shoulders stiff. I left the car in the clearing, unlocked the cabin, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The hinges creaked loudly, echoing in the small interior. Inside, the cabin was dark but simple. A small kitchen area with a sink and a rusted stove took up one corner. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, blackened with soot, and a loft above that I assumed was the sleeping area. A small wooden table sat near the center, its surface scratched and stained with old spills. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight that managed to pierce through the grime on the windows. I set down my bag, took a deep breath, and realized I could finally hear the quiet. Not the quiet of my apartment, where the hum of the refrigerator and the distant horns of cars never stopped, but a living, breathing quiet, where the wind moved through trees and the river gurgled endlessly. The first night was deceptively calm. I made a fire in the fireplace using dry kindling I found stacked near the back. The flames cast shifting shadows on the walls, giving the cabin a life of its own. I had brought a small lantern and plenty of candles, and though I had electricity, I chose to let the cabin's natural darkness dominate. I fell asleep on the loft mattress with a blanket I had brought, feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Completely alone, but not lonely. The next morning, I went exploring. The forest was alive with birds and insects. The river was clear and fast, and I walked along the bank for hours, stepping on slippery rocks and getting my boots wet. I noticed how the forest closed in the further I went. Even though the sun was bright, it felt like the shadows could swallow me whole if I stepped too far from the path. The isolation was invigorating at first. I spent the day gathering firewood and cleaning the cabin, trying to settle in as if I had lived there for months. By the third night, the first unease had settled in. It started with sounds outside, cracks and rustling that weren't quite animals, or at least not the ones I was familiar with. The forest seemed to shift, as if something moved just beyond my vision. I told myself it was nothing, just deer or raccoons. The problem was, the sounds came in patterns that didn't feel random. Heavy steps that didn't match the size of any animal I had seen, moving closer to the cabin, then stopping, then moving again. I checked the locks on the door and windows and tried to calm myself by sitting by the fire, listening to the river's constant murmur. The next day, I decided to explore the land behind the cabin. There was a steep incline, a hill that overlooked the valley below. From there, the forest seemed endless, stretching into a haze of blue mountains. As I climbed, I noticed signs of recent human activity. Footprints in the mud that weren't mine, broken branches, a scrap of fabric caught on a bush. My stomach tightened. I had thought I was alone, and now I realized I might not be. But the area was remote. Who would come here and why? The thought lingered in my mind all day. The following night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a scratching at the door. Not the soft tap of a branch or animal claw, but deliberate, sharp scratches that made my skin crawl. My heart raced. I didn't dare look outside. I sat in the dark loft, listening as the sound moved around the cabin, circling it like a predator. The fire had died down to embers, and I could see my own shadow stretching along the wall, distorted and grotesque. I wanted to run, but I knew the road was miles away, and the nearest house even further. Panic was useless here. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching a heavy stick I had picked up outside, my ears straining for any sound. By morning, the cabin was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I realized then that my escape had become a trap. The forest I had admired now seemed hostile, alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. I started keeping an eye on the windows constantly, checking the locks multiple times, and making sure the doors were secure. Every time I went outside, I carried a makeshift weapon, a hatchet I found in the shed, a long branch, even rocks if I had to. I rationed my food, made sure the firewood was stacked and dry, and tried to remind myself that I had come here for peace. Peace, however, was something the forest didn't grant freely. Days passed. The scratching and footsteps never came in daylight, only at night, as if whatever it was knew the sun would expose it. I started leaving marks on the trees around the cabin, small scratches and symbols, something to let me measure if I was being followed. The footprints continued to appear. Sometimes I would find them near the river, leading in circles, as if someone or something was waiting, watching, learning. I became obsessed with tracking them, spending hours comparing shapes and sizes, feeling my mind fray as I realized they never led anywhere, never left a pattern I could follow. I barely slept. By the fifth night, exhaustion and fear had taken their toll. I was constantly on edge. I started noticing sounds inside the cabin. The creak of the floorboards under weight I knew I hadn't put there. Items slightly shifted from where I had left them. Doors that weren't latched opened when I had closed them. I knew I was being watched. I knew it. I began preparing for confrontation, setting traps, sharpening tools, barricading the windows with anything I could move. My hands were raw, my arms sore, and my mind a constant storm of paranoia and dread. And then it happened. Around midnight, I woke to the unmistakable sound of the door handle rattling. Slow, deliberate, testing. My body froze. I could hear breathing now, low and careful, almost human. My eyes darted to the hatchet. I gripped it, my knuckles white, and crouched low. The handle rattled again, and I heard a voice in my head telling me to fight, to survive. Then silence. I waited for what felt like hours. Dawn came, weak light bleeding through the cabin windows, and everything outside was still. Nothing moved. No footprints, no sounds. Nothing. I realized then that I could not stay. The isolation I had sought for peace had turned into a nightmare I could not endure. I packed my belongings quickly, stuffing them into my car, keeping the hatchet and a few supplies for protection. I left the cabin as quickly as I could, glancing over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see someone following. The drive down the mountain road was tense, every shadow a potential threat. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my hands shaking, eyes dry, and lungs gasping for air that wasn't thick with fear. I never went back to the cabin. I sold it to someone who thought it was a charming getaway, someone who would never know the quiet horror that had waited for me in the forest. I moved to a city far away, where noise and crowds were my friends, where people everywhere meant safety, not danger. The memory of that week in the Montana woods never left me. I knew the forest had been empty of supernatural threats, but it was alive in a more terrifying way. Alive with the unknown, with the real potential for harm, with the invisible eyes that watched and waited. I survived, and I was stronger for it, but I never forgot the scratching at the door, the footprints circling in the mud, the oppressive, living quiet of the cabin. I remember the first time I set foot in the cabin. It was a mid-October morning in 2009, in the dense forests of northern Idaho. I was 24, just out of college, and I needed a break from the city life that seemed to chew up every ounce of my energy and spit me back out hollowed. The cabin was about 5 miles off the main dirt road, tucked away in a shallow valley where the trees grew thick and low, their branches intertwining like fingers over the narrow trail. I had found it online, a rental listed by some elderly couple who lived in Spokane. Pictures showed a rustic, wooden structure with a steep roof, a small porch, and a woodpile stacked neatly on the side. The listing made it seem inviting, even cozy. "Disconnect, relax, enjoy the silence," it had said. I didn't know then that silence could be suffocating. The drive from Spokane was long and winding. I remember my car crunching along gravel paths, leaves scraping against the windows as the forest thickened. The air smelled sharp with pine and damp soil, a scent I hadn't breathed in years. I arrived just before sunset, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the soft quiet of a library, or the gentle hush of a suburban street at night. This was a dense, pressing quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. The cabin itself looked smaller in person than the pictures suggested, but sturdier. Logs were darkened with age, moss creeping along the edges of the roof. The windows reflected the last of the sun, catching gold against the darkening wood. I pulled my bags inside. The interior was small, 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a stone fireplace. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and old furniture, with a touch of dampness that came from being so deep in the forest. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake off the nervous energy that clung to me since the drive. The first night was quiet, almost unreal. The wind rustled outside, and the occasional snap of a branch echoed through the valley. I had brought a stack of books, a journal, and plenty of food, thinking I could enjoy the solitude. I lit a fire in the fireplace, its crackle and warmth filling the living room. I settled into an old armchair, listening to the sounds outside. Somewhere in the darkness, an animal moved. Perhaps a deer, perhaps a fox. I didn't see it, but the sound of it was sharp and deliberate. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small creek about a quarter-mile away, its water clear and icy cold. The forest was dense, the trees rising tall and straight. The ground was uneven, roots twisting through the soil like veins. I walked carefully, noting animal tracks in the mud. Coyote, deer, something larger that I couldn't identify. I found an old, abandoned hunting stand half hidden in the trees, its wood rotted and fragile. A chill ran down my spine when I looked up at it, realizing someone had likely been watching this area years ago, waiting. By the third day, the quiet was starting to get under my skin. I found myself jumping at the slightest sound. A branch falling, a rustle in the leaves. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy, and shadows stretched long and dark over the forest floor. I started noticing things I hadn't seen at first. Footprints in the soft mud near the creek, small but unmistakably human. I chalked it up to hunters or hikers, though the area was remote enough that I wasn't expecting anyone else. Then came the storm. I woke early in the morning to wind rattling the cabin and rain hammering the roof. I watched the trees bend under the force, branches breaking and crashing to the ground. I spent most of the day inside, checking the windows to make sure they were secure and stacking more wood by the fireplace. The power flickered, though I had no electricity anyway. The rain was relentless, and the forest outside seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if it were waiting. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a branch outside, made my heart race. I lay awake imagining things I couldn't name. Around midnight, I heard something that froze me entirely. A footstep on the porch. It wasn't soft. It was deliberate, heavy. Someone had been there. I stayed still, my heart hammering, listening as the sound moved across the wood, stopped, and then retreated into the darkness. I never heard a car, never heard another sound after that, but the image of someone standing there, watching, stayed with me all night. The next day, I decided I couldn't wait for someone to come by. I had to see for myself. I checked the porch and the area around the cabin. There were footprints, fresh, wet from the rain, leading from the tree line to the porch and back into the woods. They were large, not mine. Whoever it was had been careful not to break anything, not to disturb the cabin inside. It felt calculated. I spent the day moving quietly around the cabin, carrying a hatchet I kept close. I made sure every door was locked, every window secure. The forest seemed to watch me, shadows moving in the periphery of my vision, but I saw nothing. And yet, by evening, I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The air changed, heavy and thick, and small sounds, branches snapping, rocks shifting, felt deliberate, as if someone was circling me. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up with the fire, listening, moving, checking every corner. By morning, I realized that waiting, hiding, was useless. I had to get out. I packed my things quickly, careful not to make noise. As I opened the door to leave, I saw them, two figures, just at the edge of the tree line, tall, thin, watching. I froze, heart in my throat. They didn't move closer. They didn't speak. They just stood there, silent, almost like statues. I ran. I didn't look back. My car was a mess of mud and leaves when I reached it, but I didn't care. I drove down the dirt road, through the storm, through the forest that suddenly seemed alive in every terrifying sense. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, until I reached the safety of the city lights and the noise of people moving and talking. Weeks later, I learned that the area had been used by squatters, criminals hiding out, sometimes hunting and watching travelers. Some had been arrested, some never found. The cabin itself was abandoned again, left to the forest. I never returned, and I never forgot the silence, the way the forest had seemed to move around me, and the cold certainty that I had been watched. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself I would never go somewhere like that again. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can hear the soft, deliberate snap of a branch, the whisper of leaves, the feeling of being followed, waiting, watched. It's not a ghost or a fairy tale. It's just what can happen when you are alone, isolated, in the wrong place at the wrong time. And some part of me will always remember because the fear was real and it was human. It was the winter of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city. I had just turned 30, working in a small advertising firm in Denver, and the stress had become unbearable. Endless deadlines, constant meetings, and the feeling that everyone expected me to be something I wasn't had finally pushed me to the edge. I needed a break, and I wanted complete isolation. That's how I ended up renting a small, weathered cabin tucked deep in Pine Ridge, a dense forested area about 2 hours north of the city. The cabin was advertised online by a man named Leonard, who promised peace, quiet, and nature at its purest. The pictures showed a small log structure, smoke curling from its chimney, surrounded by thick pine trees, untouched snow, and a frozen lake a few hundred meters away. It looked perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon on a Saturday. The road leading up to the cabin was narrow, covered in thick layers of snow, and lined with trees so tall and close together that sunlight barely touched the ground. Driving up, I had a momentary sense of unease, but I chalked it up to being out of practice in winter driving. I parked in front of the cabin, grabbed my bags, and trudged through the snow. The cold bit at my fingers and nose, and my breath formed small clouds in the air. The cabin's door was slightly warped from the weather, but it opened easily, creaking just enough to make the sound resonate in the quiet woods. Inside, it was rustic but comfortable. A small wood stove sat in the corner, blackened with use, and the smell of old pine filled the air. There were 2 rooms, a tiny bedroom with a single bed and a living area with a table and a few chairs. A small kitchenette had a gas stove and a sink with running water, though Leonard had warned that plumbing was unreliable in the winter. There was a single shelf with a few canned goods, a box of matches, and a rusty lantern. Everything looked old but functional. I spent the first hour unpacking and lighting the stove. The fire slowly warmed the cabin, and the sound of the wind outside mixed with the soft crackle of the fire created a strange sort of comfort. For a moment, I felt like I had escaped. I made myself a cup of instant coffee, sat by the window, and watched the snow fall. The forest was dense, silent, and endless. The lake in the distance was frozen solid, its surface reflecting the faint gray of the late afternoon sky. As night fell, I realized just how isolated I really was. The only sounds were the wind, the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of snow, and the distant creak of the frozen lake. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the cold, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise startled me. The soft groan of the cabin settling, the howl of the wind, the tapping of ice against the window. I tried to tell myself it was all natural, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone. The next morning, I woke to a clear, cold day. The sun barely rose above the trees, and the forest was a stark white and green. I made myself breakfast, eggs from a small carton I had brought, toast and coffee, and decided to explore the area. I wrapped myself in heavy layers, grabbed a small backpack with essentials, and stepped outside. The snow was deep, sinking past my ankles, and the cold was sharper than I expected. I walked towards the lake, noticing how quiet it was. No birds, no animals, nothing. Just the wind and the crunch of my boots. The ice on the lake looked solid, but I stayed near the edge, testing the thickness with a stick. It was safe enough to walk on, but I didn't dare venture too far. That day passed slowly. I chopped some firewood, collected water from a small stream nearby, and sat by the fire reading an old paperback I had brought. By evening, the cabin felt warmer, safer, and strangely alive with its own rhythms. The crackle of the fire, the occasional rustle of pine needles, the wind sighing against the walls. Yet, as night fell again, that same gnawing unease returned. Something about being completely isolated, with no one around for miles, made every shadow seem heavier, every sound louder. On the third day, something changed. I had gone to the lake to get a closer look at the ice. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the snow. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, partially covered by fresh snow, but unmistakably human. They didn't belong to me. They were smaller, like someone had walked along the edge of the lake, stopping now and then. My heart began to pound. Maybe someone else had rented the cabin recently? Or maybe it was a local, wandering through the forest? I told myself not to panic and followed the prints a short distance. They stopped abruptly near a cluster of pines, as if whoever had made them had vanished into the trees. That night, I double-checked the locks, made sure the firewood was stacked for the night, and tried to ignore the unease. But sleep was even harder to come by. Every creak of the cabin, every whistle of the wind felt amplified. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Not far off, but definitely outside the cabin. My first instinct was disbelief. Maybe it was the snow settling, maybe an animal. But the sound of boots crunching over snow was unmistakable. My pulse spiked. I grabbed the lantern and peered out the window, but the darkness was absolute. I could see nothing but the shadowed trunks of pines. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire low but still burning, listening. The footsteps didn't return, but my mind kept replaying every sound. By morning, I realized I couldn't just sit idle. I had to prepare, had to make sure I could protect myself if someone, or something, came near. I found an old hunting rifle in the corner of the cabin, dusty and rusted but serviceable. I cleaned it, checked the shells, and kept it near the bed. I also set up makeshift barricades at the doors, heavy chairs wedged against the handles, small branches nailed to the frame. It was absurd, I knew, but I didn't feel absurd. I felt vulnerable, and that feeling refused to leave. The following days were a tense routine. I explored the area cautiously, always aware of the tracks in the snow, always listening. The isolation magnified everything. The wind, the trees, even the faintest sounds. I began noticing signs of other people. Distant footprints, half-broken branches, a scrap of cloth caught on a bush. Whoever had been near the cabin had been careful, leaving almost nothing, but they were close. I realized I wasn't imagining it. Someone else was out there, moving through the forest. One afternoon, the unease escalated into fear. I was walking near the frozen lake, marking my path in the snow so I could find my way back, when I saw fresh footprints leading toward me. Large, deliberate, heavy. Not just passing through, they were coming toward the cabin. My heart pounded, my mind raced, and I ran back as fast as I could. I barricaded the cabin again, double-checked the rifle, and watched. I waited for hours, tense, unmoving, listening. Nothing happened. By nightfall, I was exhausted, scared, and frozen. I realized I couldn't stay indefinitely in this state. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed my bags, dismantled some of the barricades, and walked carefully to my car. The snow had freshened overnight, and I noticed a trail of tracks following mine from the cabin. Whoever or whatever had been out there was watching. My hands were shaking as I started the car, its engine roaring to life. I didn't look back. The drive down the narrow, snow-covered road felt endless, my eyes darting to the tree line, expecting movement. When I finally reached the main road, the sun was rising, and the world seemed to return to normal. Cars passed, people moved about their day, and the forest receded into the distance. I never returned to Pine Ridge. Months later, I learned that there had been a series of break-ins and robberies in the area that winter hunters and travelers had been targeted. The forest wasn't haunted, and there were no ghosts, but the memory of being watched, of hearing steps outside in the dark while completely alone, stayed with me. It made me understand that fear doesn't always need a supernatural cause. Sometimes the scariest thing is realizing how vulnerable you can be and how easily someone can use isolation against you. Even now, 27 years later, I can still feel the wind against the cabin walls, still hear the faint crunch of boots in snow. I don't tell many people about that trip. Most wouldn't understand the terror of being utterly alone, of knowing someone was out there, close enough to touch your life, yet far enough to remain unseen. And I never forget how good it felt to leave, to see civilization again, to be safe in the warmth of other people. That's the ending, and it's the only one that mattered. I survived, I learned, and I came back to the world alive, wary, and changed. I never imagined a weekend getaway could turn into a memory that would haunt me for years, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of how fragile you realize life can be when you're truly alone. I was 27 then, working as a freelance photographer, constantly chasing quiet places for landscapes and wildlife. That autumn, in 2014, I decided to escape the chaos of Boston and retreat to a small cabin I found through a rental listing tucked away in the northern woods of New Hampshire. Pine Hollow it was called, though hollow barely covered how isolated the place was. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that narrowed into nothing but dirt tracks as I drove further north. The forest around it was dense and dark, even in the daytime, a mix of pine and maple trees whose leaves had turned fiery orange and gold. I remember the air being cold and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I parked my old Subaru in front of the cabin, kicked back my coat, and for the first time in months, felt a genuine relief that I had made it here. The cabin itself was small, maybe 25 feet long with a loft for sleeping. Wood planks had weathered unevenly, some warped, others covered in moss, but it had a sturdy feel. The front porch sagged slightly on one corner, and the windows were streaked with rain and dust. Inside, the smell of old wood and mildew mixed with a faint trace of smoke from previous tenants. I dropped my bag, took a deep breath, and ran my hand along the rough wooden walls. I spent the first hour exploring every corner. The kitchen was tiny, just a small sink, a mini fridge, and a propane stove. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering faintly. The living area had a worn sofa, a coffee table, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. I stacked firewood nearby, remembering the warning in the listing. Would stove heat's entire cabin. Bring extra fuel if staying more than a night. Upstairs, the loft had 2 small mattresses and a single window overlooking the forest. I opened it and watched sunlight filter through branches, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the cabin floor. After unpacking my gear, I went outside to take photographs of the surrounding area. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Not a bird in sight, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. As the day went on, shadows stretched and the temperature dropped sharply. By late afternoon, I was chopping firewood and building a small fire in the stove, grateful for the warmth. I made myself a simple dinner: canned beans, a couple of energy bars, and boiled water for coffee. The first night, I stayed up later than usual, staring at the flickering fire, listening to the forest. Somewhere outside, I thought I heard a branch snap, but dismissed it as a deer or a raccoon. The first 2 days passed without incident. I explored nearby trails, photographing moss-covered trees and a small frozen creek. At night, I would sit by the stove, reading or writing notes about the shots I planned to take the next day. The isolation was peaceful, almost blissful, until the third day. It started with the sound of something hitting the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind. The trees had grown taller and denser along the trail, and branches often scraped the roof. But then I heard it again, a distinct thump against the wooden walls. My stomach sank, and I froze. No wind made that sound. I peeked out the window, scanning the surrounding trees, but saw nothing. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. I tried to convince myself it was a falling branch. Later that evening, I decided to secure the cabin better. I closed and locked every door and window, even though I had the only key. I moved the heavier furniture in front of the doors and double-checked the stove chimney to make sure nothing had blocked it. The thought that someone or something could be out there gnawed at me. I drank more coffee than usual to stay alert, listening to the forest and every little creak of the cabin settling. Around midnight, I woke to a scraping sound. Not outside this time, but near the back wall of the cabin where the small shed stood. The shed was locked, and I hadn't opened it yet. My first instinct was to ignore it, hoping it was an animal, maybe a raccoon trying to get into leftover food I had carelessly left out. But the noise repeated, slower this time, deliberate almost. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the back door. My hands were trembling. The beam of the flashlight danced over the cabin siding, across the small porch, and toward the shed. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No sign of anything unusual. The next day, I noticed a few things that made my skin crawl. First, some of the firewood I had stacked outside was knocked over. Not entirely scattered, but shifted enough that it was obvious someone or something had moved it. Second, the path I had hiked the day before had faint footprints in the mud. They weren't human shoes exactly. The prints were heavy and uneven, like someone walking barefoot but with huge, wide feet. My mind raced through rational explanations. Could it have been a bear? Possible, though bears usually avoid humans. I checked my camera gear and noticed the tripod I had left by the creek was knocked over. Nothing had been stolen, but the disturbance was unnerving. I tried to continue photographing, to focus on my work, but unease had settled deep in my chest. On the fourth day, things escalated. Early in the morning, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Not quick, like someone walking to a destination, but slow, deliberate, circling. I looked out the window and saw nothing, but the sound was too clear to ignore. My mind refused to stay rational. I packed a small backpack with essentials, knife, lighter, flashlight, water bottle, protein bars, and kept it near the stove just in case. By that evening, I was exhausted and paranoid. I kept hearing noises outside, around the cabin, in the trees, in the shadows. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. I blinked, and it was gone. The forest was playing tricks, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. I decided to stay awake, pacing the cabin, keeping the fire burning. The worst part came around 2 a.m. A loud banging shook the cabin, coming from the front door. I grabbed the knife and flashlight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I shone the light out the window. Nothing. The door was locked, but the force behind the banging made the wood vibrate. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor near the door, knife in hand, barely sleeping. By morning, I realized I couldn't stay any longer. My instincts screamed that it wasn't just animals, not just the isolation messing with my mind. Something, or someone, was deliberately trying to scare me, maybe worse. I packed quickly, shoved my gear into the car, and left without even eating breakfast. The forest seemed quiet now, almost mocking in its calmness. I drove as fast as the gravel roads allowed, not stopping until I reached the nearest gas station, where the first real people I'd seen in days were filling tanks and buying coffee. I never returned to Pine Hollow. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but there was nothing to investigate. No tracks besides the ones I saw, no signs of forced entry beyond what I described. They told me it was likely a prank, though that seemed impossible given how isolated the cabin was. The memory of that weekend has stayed with me for years. The endless quiet, the feeling of being watched, the pounding fear that someone could be just out of sight, waiting. It taught me something I hadn't realized before. Fear doesn't need ghosts. You don't need monsters hiding under the bed. Real fear comes from knowing you are completely alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of forces you cannot see or predict. The forest had felt peaceful and beautiful before that. But now, whenever I see dense trees, I remember the pounding on that cabin door, the slow circling footsteps, and the heavy, uneven footprints in the mud. I still take trips into the woods, but I never go alone, and I never return to places that promise isolation. There's something about being completely alone in the right or wrong place that teaches you about fear in the rawest form. Pine Hollow remains empty, waiting for the next person who thinks they can escape the world, not knowing the world has its own way of reminding you that solitude can be dangerous. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this. The drive out had been long, the kind where the car hums and you feel the miles stretch forever, and somewhere along the way I stopped caring about the time. The sun had been dipping behind the low hills by the time I turned off the main road, following a narrow gravel path that wound deeper into the forest. I had rented the cabin online after seeing pictures that promised solitude and a break from city life. It was advertised as off-grid, serene, and private. And for someone like me, tired of the constant noise and fluorescent lights of the office, it had seemed perfect. The gravel track was uneven, pocked with potholes and loose stones. My car jostled with each bump, the tires crunching over the surface, and the tall pine trees on either side seemed to crowd the path, their trunks dark and ominous in the fading light. By the time I saw the cabin, the last orange streaks of sunset were disappearing, leaving the forest in a dull gray. It was a small, wooden structure, weathered but sturdy. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, the paint had peeled away in places, and the porch steps creaked when I stepped on them. There was no electricity, no running water, just the cabin, a small outhouse behind it, and the endless forest. I had been expecting quiet, but standing there, alone, I realized the forest made a different kind of noise. The constant rustle of leaves, the creak of branches swaying, and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood and old fire smoke. Dust coated the surfaces, and a few cobwebs clung to the corners. It had one main room, a small kitchen in the corner, and a loft for sleeping. A cast-iron stove sat against one wall, and there was a stack of firewood near it. I set my bag down and ran my fingers over the table, noticing the scratches in the wood and the faint stains that told stories I would never know. I started a fire in the stove, the dry wood sparking and crackling as it caught. The warmth was immediate, but it didn't chase away the unease that had begun to settle in. Being alone wasn't the problem. I liked being alone, but the forest outside the cabin seemed almost alive in a way I couldn't explain. The trees pressed against the windows, and the wind moved through the branches with a sound that reminded me of footsteps. I tried to focus on simple things to distract myself. I unpacked my bag, set out a few supplies, and checked the small water jug I had brought. The cabin had a lantern, and I lit it, the soft glow illuminating the shadows in the corners of the room. I made a cup of instant coffee and sat at the table, staring at the wooden walls, trying to tell myself I was just being tired. The truth was, something about the silence made me uneasy. Night came quickly. The cabin's windows framed the black forest outside, and the wind made the branches scrape against the walls. I was too stubborn to check my phone. No signal, of course, and the thought of walking outside in the dark made my stomach tighten. I told myself I was fine. I had survived long nights alone before, but tonight felt different. It was around 2 in the morning when I first heard it. A low, dragging sound coming from outside. Not wind, not an animal. Something heavier, deliberate, moving across the forest floor. I froze, listening. My heart started beating faster. The sound stopped suddenly, and then I heard it again, closer this time. My mind raced. Could it be a deer? But deer didn't move like that, and the rhythm of the noise didn't fit anything natural. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, a trick of the wind and the trees, but then I realized something worse. I had left the door unlocked. The latch wasn't complex. A small metal hook was all that kept the outside out. And now, sitting at the table, I understood that if someone or something wanted in, it could get in with ease. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and moved toward the door, my steps slow and careful on the wooden floor. I peered through the small window, shining the light into the blackness beyond. The forest was still empty, but I could feel it, a presence just beyond the reach of the light. The dragging noise had stopped, but the sense of being watched didn't. I spent the next hour checking all the windows and doors, making sure they were as secure as possible. My body was tense, my ears straining for any sound. I lit another small fire, stacking the logs higher, needing the comfort of the warmth and the light. Eventually, I sat back down at the table, trying to calm myself with deep breaths. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Probably just a raccoon or some other small creature moving across the yard. I tried to sleep, lying on the thin mattress in the loft above. The cabin was creaky, each gust of wind outside sending small vibrations through the wooden frame. The branches scratched against the roof, and the distant sounds of the forest never ceased. My eyes stayed open, the darkness heavy around me, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. I woke to the sound of breaking glass. My heart jumped into my throat. It was still dark, though the first hints of dawn were starting to show behind the trees. I grabbed the flashlight and ran down the stairs, my bare feet slapping against the wood. A small pane of the kitchen window had been shattered. Cold air rushed in, and shards of glass sparkled on the floor. I scanned the room, my hands shaking. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place except the broken window. And then I noticed it. Footprints in the thin layer of dirt tracked from the broken window to the door. Large, heavy prints. They weren't human, not entirely, but they weren't small animals either. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Whoever or whatever had done this, they had been in the cabin. I moved quickly, barricading the door and the remaining windows with pieces of wood and anything I could find. My phone was useless, no signal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Panic settled into my chest like a stone. I felt trapped. The forest outside seemed to close in, the shadows stretching toward the cabin as if they were alive. Hours passed. I didn't dare sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling, and the dragging noise had returned. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. At one point, I thought I saw a figure moving between the trees, always just beyond the reach of the flashlight. I felt completely exposed, the walls of the cabin thin and fragile compared to the darkness outside. By midday, I realized I couldn't stay inside forever. I needed help. I couldn't wait for the creature to make a move. I packed a small bag with water, a few tools, and the strongest knife I had. I planned my route carefully, memorizing the path through the trees, avoiding open spaces, and keeping to the shadows. I waited for a moment when the forest seemed quiet, took a deep breath, and ran. The run back to the main road felt endless. Every snapping twig and shifting shadow made me lunge sideways or duck behind trees. My legs burned, lungs screamed for air, but the thought of the cabin behind me, and whatever was still there, kept me moving. The gravel road appeared like a beacon, and when I finally reached it, I collapsed, gasping, my hands scraping against stones. A passing car eventually stopped. I waved frantically, the driver staring at me like I was insane, but they understood enough to pull over. I didn't care. I jumped in, shaking and exhausted, and gave the shortest, simplest explanation I could. Someone, something, was in the cabin. The driver nodded, called the police, and waited while I retraced the path in my mind. Later, when the authorities checked the cabin, they found evidence of forced entry and signs of someone, maybe more than one person, having been inside. The footprints were gone, wiped away by wind or whoever had been there, but it was clear I hadn't imagined it. I never went back, and I never stayed anywhere off-grid again. The memory stayed with me, though. I still see the dark trees pressing against the windows, hear the scraping of branches, and feel the weight of being completely alone in a place that feels small and fragile compared to the forest outside. It taught me something. Isolation isn't peaceful. It's exposing. And sometimes, the real fear isn't ghosts or monsters. It's knowing that if someone wanted in, there would be nothing stopping them. I hadn't meant to get lost. I had been driving through the northern part of Maine in late October, the kind of road where the trees are so close together you can barely see the sun. I had been planning a weekend alone at a small cabin I had rented for months. Something quiet, somewhere I could read and hike without anyone around. My name is Eric. I was 32 at the time, and I had been looking forward to this for weeks. The first part of the drive had been easy, the highway wide and familiar, but as I turned onto the smaller state roads, the scenery changed. The trees were taller, older, their branches tangled like the fingers of someone hiding in the woods. The air felt colder, sharp enough that I could see my breath inside the car even though it wasn't freezing. I had my phone GPS, but the signal was patchy. At some point, the directions said to turn left, and I did, trusting the blue line on the tiny screen. That's when the road narrowed and changed from asphalt to rough gravel. It was the kind of gravel that crunches under your tires like broken glass, and I knew I was far enough from civilization that a wrong turn could be dangerous. The trees on both sides were so thick that the late afternoon light barely touched the ground. The silence was heavy. I didn't hear birds or wind, just the low hum of the car engine. Every now and then, a branch would scrape against the car like a warning. I didn't realize it yet, but I had passed the last sign of another road or house. After nearly an hour of driving slowly over gravel and potholes, I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. A one-story structure with dark wooden walls and a steep roof, partially covered in dead leaves. Smoke was curling from the chimney, which was strange because the listing had said the cabin would be empty, fully ready for guests. Still, the place looked stable, if weathered, with a small porch and windows that reflected the darkening sky. I parked in the little driveway and stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles, the kind of smell that makes you want to breathe slowly and deliberately. I noticed footprints in the dirt near the door, but they were old and partially washed away by rain. I shrugged it off. Maybe the owner had come to prepare the cabin. I had my bag and my groceries, so I unlocked the door and went inside. The cabin was exactly as it had been described online. Rustic, simple, clean. A small living area with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with a kettle and some dishes, a bedroom with a bed and a dresser. There was a stack of firewood near the door and a single chair facing the stove. I set my bag down and lit a fire to warm the place. Outside, the sun was almost gone, and the forest around the cabin had become a shadowy wall. By nightfall, I felt a strange sort of pressure in the air. Not fear exactly, but a tightness in my chest. I had been alone before in isolated places, but something about this cabin felt different. I told myself it was just the silence, the darkness outside, and the cold creeping under the cabin walls. I had brought a flashlight, so I wasn't worried. I ate some canned soup, read for a while, and went to bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. It was subtle at first, a soft tapping against the wooden walls. I froze. It didn't sound like the wind. The windows were closed. It was almost rhythmic, like someone walking slowly outside, the sound muffled by the ground and leaves. I got up, grabbing the flashlight, and walked to the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. I went back to bed, thinking it was just a raccoon or some deer. But then the tapping came again, closer, and this time from the back of the cabin. I got up fully, heart hammering, and moved toward the back door. My mind ran through every rational explanation, telling myself that the isolation had made me paranoid. Still, the sounds were deliberate, footsteps that stopped and started, as if someone was walking around the cabin slowly, circling it. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and opened the back door. The air hit me sharply, and my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness beyond the porch. I couldn't see anyone, and the ground was soft and wet. The footsteps had stopped. I felt the cold sweat of fear on my back, and my stomach dropped. I decided to lock every door and window and stay awake until dawn. Hours passed. Every little sound, the wind shaking branches, a distant animal call, made my stomach knot. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the window, but when I turned on the outside light, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep. By the time morning came, my nerves were raw. When I stepped outside in daylight, I realized something unsettling. Around the cabin, there were footprints in the mud. Human footprints. They weren't fresh, but they were close enough that someone had clearly been circling the cabin in the night. I checked my car. Nothing had been disturbed, nothing stolen. But the knowledge that someone had been so close and had possibly watched me sleep made my stomach turn. I spent the day cautiously exploring the surroundings. The cabin was isolated, at least half a mile from any road. No houses, no trails, nothing. Just thick forest. I noticed something else. Marks on trees, shallow cuts, as if someone had been trying to carve something or leave signs. Couldn't tell what. The idea that someone had been out here, waiting for darkness, made me realize how alone I truly was. That night, I prepared differently. I barricaded the doors as best as I could with furniture, kept a fire burning, and placed the kitchen knife beside my bed. The sounds started again just after midnight. This time I was ready. Every tap, every scratch on the walls, every muffled thump made me grip the knife tighter. Hours dragged. At some point, I heard movement outside, slow and careful, pacing back and forth. Then silence. By the third day, I was exhausted, barely able to think straight. I had considered leaving, but the roads were muddy and difficult. My phone barely worked, with maybe a single bar if I climbed onto the porch and held it just right. I knew if someone wanted to harm me, calling for help wouldn't be easy. Then I made a decision that probably saved me. I remembered the small trail I had seen earlier while exploring, a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. It wasn't on the map, but I figured if I could reach another road, I could get help. That morning, I packed a bag with food, water, and my flashlight. I left the cabin quietly, making sure the doors were locked behind me. The trail was rough, roots twisted underfoot, and the ground was slippery from the rain. I moved slowly, keeping my ears open for anyone following. The forest seemed endless, every turn looking the same, shadows thick among the trees. After what felt like hours, I began to hear the distant hum of a road, the faint crunch of tires on gravel. My pace quickened. Finally, I stumbled onto a narrow road, muddy but usable. After walking for another 30 minutes, I saw a truck approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. A local man named Tom gave me a ride back to the nearest town. He listened to my story, skeptical at first, but he knew the area. He told me that people occasionally squat in abandoned cabins, and some of them were dangerous. He said it was lucky I had noticed the footprints before they had tried anything. The police followed up, checked the cabin. It was officially vacant. No one had legal access. They found signs someone had been living there in secret, makeshift bedding, scraps of food, and a few tools. Nothing had been stolen, and they had no idea how long the person had been watching. They called it trespassing and a potential threat, but the reality was scarier than that. Someone had been nearby, waiting, unnoticed, in a place most people wouldn't even think to check. I never went back to that area. The cabin was abandoned again when I checked months later. But I remember the cold fear of the forest, the feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps circling the cabin at night. And even now, years later, I know how close I had come to being in real danger. That weekend was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it taught me how quickly isolation can become terrifying, and how careful you have to be when the woods are quiet and the world feels far away. It was the spring of 2009 when I decided to escape the city for a few days. I was 24, exhausted from long hours at a software company in Minneapolis, and desperate to get away from the hum of fluorescent lights, constant notifications, and the crowded streets. The idea was simple. Rent a small, isolated cabin in northern Wisconsin, near a lake, and spend some time alone with nothing but the woods and water. I had always liked solitude, and after a long winter of cramped apartments and restless nights, it felt necessary. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was a one-room structure of weathered pine logs, perched at the edge of a small clearing that led to the lake. The owner, a wiry man named Harold, had told me it was quiet, private, and perfect for thinking. There was no electricity, just a small propane heater, a lantern, and a wood stove. There was a single bedroom loft and a small outhouse out back. Internet, phone signal almost non-existent. Just the forest, the water, and me. It sounded like heaven. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The sky was a soft orange, and the lake reflected it like a mirror. Walking up the narrow dirt path to the cabin, I noticed how quiet everything was. Not a single car, no distant sounds of civilization. Just birds settling for the night and the gentle rustle of wind through the pines. The air smelled sharp and clean, with the faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The smell of old wood, dust, and a faint trace of smoke from a past occupant filled the small space. I unpacked my bags slowly, appreciating the rhythm of simple movements. I stacked my clothes neatly, laid out a small camping stove I'd brought, and checked the woodpile for enough logs to last the night. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, carrying the scent of water across the clearing. I lit the lantern, and the room filled with a warm yellow glow, throwing shadows across the rough walls. Night fell faster than I expected. By the time I had a small fire going in the stove, the sun had vanished completely, leaving only the soft shimmer of stars above the lake. The forest around me was no longer just quiet. It was immense. The darkness outside the cabin pressed against the windows like a living thing. Every movement of the trees, every whisper of wind, sounded louder. I sat in a chair near the stove, sipping water from my bottle and trying to settle my mind. My city life had trained me to be constantly alert, and I realized just how tense I had been without noticing. Here, with nothing but silence, my thoughts started to wander. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. A faint, deliberate crackling from the forest. At first, I told myself it was a branch falling, or maybe an animal, but it didn't feel random. It was rhythmic, slow, and deliberate, like something large moving carefully, almost watching me. I tried to shake it off. There were deer in these woods, maybe a raccoon. The wind could have shifted branches, but the sound didn't stop. It circled. I could hear it on the right side of the cabin, then behind me, then to the left. I froze, listening. Every instinct in me screamed that I wasn't alone, even though I logically knew the odds of someone being out here at this hour were low. I kept my fire going, staring into the flames, willing my imagination to stop turning the shadows into shapes. Eventually, the sounds stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against the walls of the cabin. I convinced myself to climb into the loft bed, leaving the lantern low by the stove, the fire casting enough light to make the room feel inhabited. Sleep came slowly, broken by every creak of the wooden walls and rustle from the trees outside. The next morning, the sun came up in a pale, cold light. I brewed coffee over my camping stove and stepped outside, trying to calm myself with the bright, rational clarity of day. The forest looked completely normal. Birds were flying through the trees. The lake lapped gently against the shore. Nothing seemed out of place. I laughed at myself for being scared, for letting my imagination run wild. I decided to spend the day exploring the surroundings. The cabin sat on the edge of a small private road that wound through dense forest. I walked the narrow path, noticing subtle details I hadn't before. The underbrush flattened in some areas as though someone or something had passed recently, the ground near the lake's edge slightly disturbed. I tried not to overthink it. Animals passed through the area all the time. By the afternoon, The sun had warmed the cabin enough that I could sit outside and enjoy the lake. I took a small notebook and began writing, trying to capture the peace I had felt when I first arrived. But as the shadows lengthened, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate crackling from the woods. My stomach clenched. I was closer to the edge of the clearing now, and I could see the shadowed line of trees. Something was moving there. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a large deer, maybe an animal foraging. But there was a certain intent to the movement. Animals didn't stop, pause, and shift position slowly, with measured sounds that seemed too careful to be random. I told myself to stay calm, to stay rational. I had a firewood supply, a fully stocked cabin, and my phone still had some battery for emergencies. Nothing could happen here, right? That night, I doubled the firewood near the stove and hung an extra lantern by the door. I also moved a chair so I could sit with my back to the wall, facing the window that looked into the forest. The sounds started again, almost on cue, just as the last light of the day disappeared. I could hear twigs snapping, soft thuds on the dirt, and the occasional dragging sound, like something brushing against the forest floor. My mind started racing. Hours passed and I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a figure in the trees, crouching just beyond the edge of the clearing. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see it. I kept the lantern lit low, the stove fire burning, and tried to remind myself I was safe. I even considered leaving, but my truck was buried deep in the path behind the cabin, and I didn't want to move in the dark through a forest I barely knew. Morning arrived in a gray haze, bringing a heavy mist that hovered above the lake and over the trees. I left the cabin cautiously, examining the area around me. Footprints, large, irregular, human-like. Not deer, not any animal I could identify. Someone had been here, last night or earlier. The prints led into the woods, circling the cabin, stopping just at the treeline. My blood ran cold. This was real. Someone or multiple people had been moving through these woods, watching me. I decided I had to leave, but I wanted to see if there was any logical explanation. I checked the outhouse first, making sure no one had hidden there. Nothing. Then I walked the perimeter of the cabin. Broken branches, more large footprints, and impressions in the dirt where someone had knelt. It was deliberate, almost ritualistic, but there was no fantasy here, no supernatural force. Just someone real, close, watching, perhaps waiting. I returned to the cabin, packed my bag, and kept my eyes on the treeline. As I loaded the last of my gear into the truck, movement. Something at the edge of the forest, maybe 50 feet away. I couldn't make it out clearly, only a dark shape shifting slightly. My heart raced. I jumped into the truck, started it, and didn't look back as I drove down the narrow road, kicking up dust and leaving the cabin behind. The weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The police told me they couldn't do much. Footprints and forest impressions disappear quickly, and there were no reports of missing people nearby. Harold, the owner, said he had never heard of anyone staying there being watched or followed, but he admitted locals sometimes wandered the woods and didn't like visitors. I realized that sometimes danger isn't obvious. There were no monsters, no ghosts, just people and the terrifying fact that someone could be there, close enough to watch without being seen. Eventually, I found peace in the memory of the lake in daylight, the smell of pine, the isolation I had craved. But I never returned to that cabin, and I never stopped double-checking locks, windows, and shadows at night, even in my city apartment. The woods taught me something simple and terrifying. Real fear doesn't need fantasy. It doesn't need monsters. It only needs someone or something real and unseen moving in the dark. Perfect. Here's part 1 of your realistic first-person cabin horror story. I've made it immersive, gritty, and detailed, with realistic fears, survival tension, and a clear style. I'll continue in parts until we reach your requested length. It was the winter of 1998, the kind of bitterly cold December that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. I was 27, exhausted from a relentless year in the city, and desperate to escape. A cabin in northern Vermont had been cheap, too cheap, honestly, and I probably should have questioned that. But I didn't. The photos online showed a rustic, isolated cabin nestled among snow-laden pines, a small frozen lake nearby, and a promise of silence I hadn't felt in years. Silence sounded perfect. I drove up in my old Subaru, the engine whining against the cold, tires crunching on the compacted snow. The sky was heavy with clouds, gray and oppressive, threatening snow, though it hadn't started yet. The GPS signal dropped about 10 miles before the cabin, and I had to rely on a paper map that had already become creased and smudged from the wet and cold. The road narrowed into a barely passable track, winding and twisting between thick trees, shadows stretching long even in late afternoon light. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as the car slipped once on a hidden patch of ice, heart hammering, and thinking, this is going to be worth it. When I finally reached the cabin, it sat exactly as the picture suggested. A rough-hewn wooden structure, 2 stories, with a steep roof covered in snow. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney. I parked in the narrow clearing, stepped out, and was hit immediately by that icy, clean air that makes your lungs burn and your face sting. The forest was quiet except for the occasional creak of branches under snow. My first thought was relief. My second was that the place was far more isolated than I'd realized. The door opened with a stiff groan, the kind of sound that made you check twice that nobody was standing behind it. Inside, the cabin was dark but serviceable. Dust hung in the corners, floating in the weak sunlight through frost-laced windows. There was a wood stove, a small kitchenette, and a loft that promised a bed. I set my bags down, struck a match, and the place suddenly felt warmer. The smell of damp wood and old pine filled the room, oddly comforting. I spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring, noting the little details. The warped floorboards, the thin walls, the way the ceiling sagged slightly in the corners. Nothing screamed danger, at least not consciously. But a part of me noticed every shadow, every creak, every settling noise, like the house was breathing. I laughed at myself, telling myself it was just the old wood. By nightfall, a snowstorm had begun, thick and heavy. The world outside the windows disappeared behind a swirling white curtain. The wind howled, bending the trees so hard I thought one might fall. I stacked firewood carefully near the stove and made a small dinner, the kind that only required a pot and a stovetop. I tried to read, but the storm outside drowned every sound of pages turning. I went to bed early, telling myself I'd sleep like a log. I didn't. I woke around 3 in the morning to a strange thumping. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized the sound was irregular, deliberate, like something heavy hitting the roof in one place repeatedly. My stomach dropped. The first rational thought was an animal. Bears hibernate this time of year, and wolves usually keep to the woods. But the sound was too heavy, too precise. I wrapped a blanket around myself, shivering, and forced myself to listen. The thumping stopped after a minute, replaced by a silence so deep it felt unnatural. By sunrise, the storm had passed, leaving a thick, silent blanket of snow. The world outside looked pristine, untouched, but the sense of unease lingered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, and decided to check the perimeter. The snow was deep, nearly 2 feet in some places, and every step I took sank into it, muffling my movements. I circled the cabin slowly, noting no footprints except my own. There were no signs of wildlife except for a few scattered rabbit tracks, which seemed impossible given the storm. The more I looked, the more I felt an oppressive emptiness, like the forest itself was watching. I returned inside, my boots wet and snow-laden, and shut the door firmly. I started the stove, trying to convince myself I was safe. That's when I noticed it, scratches. Not on the floor, not on the walls, but along the lower part of the door frame outside. Deep, jagged, fresh scratches. My stomach sank. They were too low for an adult human to make, at least standing, but too deliberate to be random tree branches. I stared at them for minutes, heart hammering, mind racing. For the rest of that day, I stayed inside, checking locks, pushing chairs against the doors, pacing constantly. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone, but the scratches had broken the illusion of safety. Every shadow felt heavier, every creak sharper. I realized, with a rising panic, that I wasn't alone in the forest. I thought about leaving, driving back the way I came, but the storm had closed the narrow tracks, and I hadn't seen anyone for miles. The nearest town was over 30 minutes away if roads were clear. I was trapped. That night, I prepared the cabin differently. I moved the furniture to barricade the door, sharpened a kitchen knife, and piled firewood near me. I stayed awake, flashlight on, listening. The thumping came again around midnight, slower this time, more methodical. I could hear faint scraping, like something moving just beyond the windows. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I crouched near the stove, knife in hand, telling myself to stay calm, to rationalize. But the rational part of me was gone. Hours passed. Then came the sound of breathing. Not my own, shallow in the cold air, but heavier, uneven, deliberate, and always outside. I stayed frozen, unwilling to move, until dawn. When the sun finally rose, everything outside looked undisturbed, except for the tracks. Footprints in the snow, deep and wide, led up to the cabin from the trees, circling once, then disappearing back into the forest. No prints left afterward. I spent the next 2 days in a terrified haze. I didn't leave the cabin, didn't make noise. I rationed food and water, kept the fire going, and checked the perimeter constantly. Each night, the noises returned. Thumping, scraping, heavy breathing. Each night, I barricaded more effectively, convinced the cabin itself would protect me. By the third night, I realized it wasn't just a random intruder or animal. Whoever or whatever was out there, they knew I was alone. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It was a trap. I thought of calling for help, but there was no signal, no one within miles. My only option was to wait, stay alive, and hope the visitor eventually left. On the fourth morning, I woke to a different sound entirely. It was faint, a rhythmic tapping, not at the door or windows, but somewhere inside. My stomach dropped. I retraced my steps, checking every inch of the cabin. Everything seemed normal. I checked the loft, the cupboards, the basement, nothing. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I started hearing things even when the cabin was silent. Footsteps above me, whispers of movement. I felt like I was unraveling. Perfect. Here's a fully imagined, realistic, first-person scary cabin story. Long, detailed, and with a clear ending. I'll make it immersive, grounded, and free of ghosts or fairy tale elements. I'll also change all names, places, and details to make it unique. I didn't plan on being here. I had been driving for hours on the back roads of northern Montana, the kind of roads that twist through dense forests and climb jagged hills that look untouched by humans for decades. I wasn't even sure why I had taken this route. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the stubborn part of me that thought I could outrun my own thoughts. By the time I saw the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the forest around me had already started to dim in the fading sunlight. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance. Its wood was weathered, the paint almost entirely gone, and the roof had patches where shingles were missing. Still, it stood solidly among the pines, a little miracle of survival against the elements. I parked my truck on the overgrown driveway, which was more of a trail now than anything else, and I stepped out, my boots crunching over frost-hardened leaves. It smelled of pine, wet earth, and old smoke. I had been on the road for nearly 10 hours, hadn't eaten, hadn't slept properly in 2 nights, and I was tired to the bone. Something about the cabin called to me, not in a mystical sense, just as a shelter. I pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. The air was cold but not unbearable. Dust motes floated in the streams of light from the small, grimy windows. The cabin had a single room with a rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a stone fireplace with a rusted metal grate. A few broken shelves clung to the walls. I could tell it hadn't been lived in for years, maybe even a decade. There were remnants of old life, an empty coffee tin, a cracked mug, a torn blanket stuffed in the corner, but nothing recent. I set my backpack down and looked around. The isolation of the place hit me all at once. There were no sounds except the occasional wind rattling the trees outside and the distant call of a bird. Even the forest seemed paused, holding its breath. I decided to make a fire. I had a small lighter in my bag and some dry kindling I scavenged from a fallen tree outside. The first few strikes of the lighter seemed to take forever before finally catching. The flames trembled and then roared to life, filling the cabin with a flickering orange glow. Felt safe. Temporarily. I ate the few granola bars I had left and drank water from my bottle. I sat back on the floor against the wall, letting the warmth sink into my bones, and tried to relax. But as soon as I started thinking about sleep, the silence around me became a weight. Every little sound seemed amplified. A branch scraping against the roof sounded like a hammer. The wind whistling through a crack in the wall sounded like whispering. I kept telling myself I was just tired, that the mind played tricks when it was hungry and lonely. I slept fitfully that night. Every sound pulled me awake. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a thump somewhere outside. My heart started hammering. I lay perfectly still, listening. There was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a falling branch. I told myself that over and over until exhaustion pulled me under again. When I woke in the morning, sunlight spilling through the window made the cabin look less threatening. I thought I'd relax, make coffee, plan the next part of my trip. But as I stepped outside to collect firewood, I noticed something that froze me in place. Footprints. Human footprints, muddy and fresh, leading from the edge of the trees toward the cabin. My stomach sank. I had told myself I was alone. I always thought being alone was safe. I didn't hear anyone at first. No voices, no rustling, no footsteps. But I started noticing other signs. Broken twigs on the path I hadn't walked, a faint smell of smoke that didn't come from my fire, and a faint scuffing near the back window. Panic began to grow, rational fear mixing with primal instincts. Whoever was out there had been moving around the cabin while I slept. I didn't want to leave. The nearest town was miles down a winding forest road, and I wasn't sure anyone would hear me if I called. I packed my backpack quietly and stuffed a few more supplies into it. A flashlight, my pocket knife, a small first aid kit, and the rest of my water. I left the fire burning low in the fireplace, hoping it would create the illusion that someone was still here, asleep and unaware. I slipped out the back door. The forest seemed different now, heavier somehow, like it was closing in. I stayed low, crouching behind trees, listening. Every snapping branch made me flinch. I kept my eyes on the cabin the whole time, scanning for movement. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move across a window, but when I blinked, it was gone. I moved slowly, following a shallow ridge that would eventually lead me down to a dirt road I had seen earlier. That's when I heard the voice. Not talking, not yelling, just a low murmur, enough to make my blood run cold. It wasn't coming from the cabin. It was from behind me, from deeper in the woods. I froze. My first instinct was to run, but I didn't want to reveal my position. I waited, counting my heartbeats, telling myself to stay calm. The sound stopped. I started moving again, faster this time, careful not to make a noise. My legs burned, my lungs were tight, but I forced myself to keep going. Eventually, I saw the dirt road. I broke into a run, feeling a mixture of relief and terror as the forest thinned. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station a few miles down the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the door. I told the clerk I needed to call the police, but I couldn't form the words at first. Eventually, I managed to describe the cabin, the footprints, the sounds. They didn't dismiss me, but they didn't seem entirely surprised either. I didn't stay to wait for anyone. I bought a map, filled my tank, and left that area as fast as I could. Weeks later, I went back with proper gear and a small group of friends. The cabin was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone living there. Nothing except the remnants of the life that had been there years before. It was as if I had imagined everything. But I knew I hadn't. I didn't tell anyone about the sounds, the shadow in the window, or the voice. I didn't want them to think I had lost my mind. I realized afterward that the real danger wasn't supernatural or mystical. It was people. Someone could have been hiding there for days or weeks, watching anyone who came near. The forest was vast, but the cabin was isolated enough to be perfect for someone with intentions I didn't want to think about. I never returned to that area alone. I didn't travel those back roads again, but I carry the memory with me. The cold weight of isolation, the feeling of being watched when there's no one around, and the knowledge that sometimes the scariest things are entirely real. And most of all, I learned to trust my instincts. When something feels wrong, no amount of reasoning or wishful thinking can convince you otherwise. That cabin didn't hold ghosts or fairy tales. It held fear, the kind that makes your blood run cold and your thoughts scatter. And knowing that, I survived. It was the winter of 1987, late January, when I found myself driving down a narrow, winding forest road in northern Vermont. I was 23, tired, and eager for a break from the chaos of my life in Boston. My plan was simple: rent a small cabin for the weekend, disappear into the woods, and do nothing but read, eat, and sleep. Nothing fancy, nothing crowded, just peace. I had rented a cabin through a small local service that promised solitude and comfort. The GPS on my old car barely worked out there, but I had printed the directions. That would later turn out to be both helpful and frustrating. The snow was heavy, though not impossible, and the trees along the road were coated in thick layers of white. The branches bent under the weight, sometimes scraping against my windshield. Every mile deeper into the forest made me feel lighter, like the stress of the city was being stripped away. But there was also a growing tension I couldn't name, a feeling that something in the silence was watching, waiting. By mid-afternoon, the road narrowed into more of a track than a real path. Tire ruts were hidden beneath the snow, and I had to drive slowly to avoid sliding off the edge. My car, an old Chevy Nova, groaned under the effort. I had been on the road for nearly 3 hours when I saw it. The cabin. It was small, perhaps 20 by 20 feet, with a peaked roof and a stone chimney. Snow covered everything, and the wood siding was dark from moisture. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though I had no idea if anyone was inside. A small sign hung crookedly by the door, "Harrison Cabin." A shiver ran down my spine, not from cold, but from the sense that the world beyond the trees had disappeared. I parked, cut the engine, and stepped out. The snow crunched under my boots, and the silence pressed against me. Only the occasional creak of ice from a distant branch broke it. The air was sharp, tasting of pine and frozen earth. I unlocked the door with a key I had been given. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A wood stove sat in the corner with a stack of split logs nearby. There was a small table, a couple of chairs, and a twin bed pushed against the far wall. The kitchen was basic: a small fridge, a propane stove, and a cupboard with a few canned goods. I set down my bag, took a deep breath, and let the quiet settle in. By the time I had unpacked, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The forest outside was now black, a mass of shapes under the snow. I lit the wood stove, and the cabin slowly filled with a warm glow. I cooked a simple dinner, ate, and then sat in the chair by the stove, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. First, it was comforting. I felt removed from the world, isolated in a way I hadn't in years. But as night deepened, the silence began to change. Outside, there were sounds, subtle, small, almost imperceptible. The scrape of branches against the cabin, the distant snap of ice or snow under pressure. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest settling. But each sound made my heart jump. Around midnight, I decided to check the cabin's windows. Moonlight reflected off the snow, and I could barely see the tree line. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, deep in the snow, leading from the tree line to the cabin door. Panic hit me. I hadn't heard anyone approach. The tracks were single, as if someone had walked carefully, watching, calculating. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and edged toward the door. My hands shook. The footprints stopped abruptly at the doorstep, and there was no sign of anyone. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat in the corner near the stove, trying to calm myself. Every shadow now seemed alive. Every creak and groan of the cabin made me flinch. Hours passed, slow and merciless. The storm outside intensified, snow piling against the door and windows. My food was gone, my water ration untouched, but hunger was irrelevant compared to fear. I tried to sleep, curling under the thin blanket, but each time I drifted, I heard movement outside. Soft footsteps, crunching snow, the faint sound of breathing, or maybe it was my imagination. By dawn, the storm had quieted, leaving a thick, blinding layer of snow across everything. I dared to look outside. The footprints had vanished, completely erased by the wind-blown snow. Relief surged, but it was mixed with exhaustion and a strange sense of being watched even now. I needed to leave, but the car was buried. Snow had piled against it up to the doors. Digging it out would take hours, and the cold was bone deep. I realized then that I had no phone service, no way to call for help if anything went wrong. I was completely alone, with only the forest, the cabin, and my fear. I spent the day inside, rationing food and keeping the fire going. I couldn't shake the feeling that the footprints had been real. Someone had been here. Maybe they were still out there, somewhere in the woods. Every noise made me flinch. Every shadow seemed alive. I thought about staying put until the storm cleared, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. Night came again. I huddled near the stove, watching the door. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. A low, slow scraping at the back of the cabin. Not the front where the footprints had been, but the back near the woodpile. My pulse raced. The sound stopped, then started again, deliberate, slow, methodical. I remembered the hunting rifle in the corner, left by the cabin owner for emergencies. I had never fired a gun before, but I grabbed it, checked the chamber, and held it tightly. The scraping continued, circling the cabin. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving around me, testing, listening. Hours felt like days. I didn't sleep, barely moved. The morning light finally broke, and with it, the sounds ceased. Exhausted, I crept outside. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone. The snow was untouched except for mine and the car. Relief was mixed with disbelief. How had someone or something approached so closely without leaving any trace? I spent the next day clearing the snow from the car and slowly making my way back down the forest road. The storm had turned into a quiet, white landscape. When I reached the main road, I found a gas station, warmed up, and tried to shake the events from my mind. I never went back to that cabin. The owner never mentioned anything unusual when I returned the key. But I still think about it, the footprints, the sounds, the feeling of being watched in a place where no one should be. I can't explain it, and I know I might never know. All I know is that sometimes being alone in the woods is more terrifying than anything else I've experienced. It was the spring of 2012 when I decided I needed to get away. Life had become a mess of small failures and constant noise, and the city felt like a cage I could no longer breathe in. Work had been draining. My apartment was crammed and loud, and the breakup with Hannah had left a hollow ache that no distraction seemed to fill. I needed silence. I needed isolation. That's why I drove north, far past the last town with any real stores, into the mountains of Montana. The GPS said I'd reach a small cabin near a clearing by late afternoon. In reality, the last stretch was a gravel road that had more potholes than flat surface, winding past thick forests and steep hills. The cabin itself looked like something out of a postcard. Wood-paneled, rustic but sturdy, with a small chimney and a porch sagging just enough to look lived in but not broken. I parked my old sedan in the driveway, the gravel crunching under tires and echoing in the surrounding forest. I stepped out, took a deep breath of crisp air, and for the first time in months, felt like I could just exist. The mountains rose around me, jagged and covered in pine and fir, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird call. No roads, no neighbors, no phones. My cell service had already disappeared 2 miles back. I unloaded my bags, each one stuffed with essentials. Clothes, food, a small camping stove, a first aid kit, water, and a few novels I never ended up reading. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, pine, and something faintly damp, the scent of a place closed up for winter but still standing firm. Dust lay thick on the corners of the floorboards, and spider webs stretched across the beams. It was quiet, except for the creaks of the old structure settling under its own weight. I dropped my bags and sank into a chair near the fireplace. The sun was still climbing, but the shadows were long. It already felt colder than I expected. The first night, I cooked a simple dinner of canned soup and bread. The kitchen was minimal. A small stove, a sink with running water, thankfully, and a fridge that hummed softly. I lit a small lantern on the table and ate alone, the silence pressing in around me. Out the window, the forest looked endless, dark, and patient. The thought of sleeping here alone was comforting at first, but a tiny prickle of unease ran down my spine. I tried to push it away. I reminded myself that fear here was my own invention, the isolation, the unknown, nothing else. By nightfall, I settled into the bed. The cabin creaked, as all old wooden houses do, and I could hear the wind making the trees scrape and groan. At some point, I thought I heard something else, a snapping branch, perhaps too deliberate to be random. I held my breath, telling myself it was just an animal. But sleep was elusive. I kept listening to the dark, aware of every tiny sound. The next day, I explored the surrounding area. The forest was dense, and the ground uneven, covered in roots and loose soil. I hiked down to a small creek that curved around a bend in the trees. The water was cold and clear, running fast over smooth rocks. I knelt down, cupped my hands, and drank. Alone in the wilderness, I felt both fragile and powerful. A strange combination I didn't expect. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. On the porch, near the edge, there were footprints in the mud. Not mine, not fresh enough to be random tracks from a deer or a dog, but human. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone on the way in. Nobody should be here. The footprints led from the tree-line to the porch, stopped, and disappeared into the forest again. I told myself it was someone who had been here before, perhaps a ranger or a previous tenant checking in. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. My stomach churned. I made sure the doors were locked. The thought of someone walking around outside while I slept made the cabin suddenly feel less like refuge and more like a trap. That night, I kept a baseball bat by the bed. Every little noise made me jump. The wind, the trees, and once, a loud thump on the roof. I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon perhaps, but my imagination filled in the rest. Someone could be watching, waiting. I sat awake for hours, listening, my heart hammering. Eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of someone at the window. Morning brought more exploration. I decided to hike farther into the forest to push the uneasy thoughts from my mind. The deeper I went, the wilder the terrain. Thick undergrowth slowed my pace, and fallen logs created obstacles I had to climb over or duck under. About 2 miles from the cabin, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned logging camp, rusted equipment, broken tools, and a half-collapsed shack. The place looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but someone had been here recently. Fresh footprints cut through the overgrowth, leading back into the trees. I followed them, curiosity overpowering caution. They led to a small clearing, and I froze. There, hidden behind a thick wall of pine trees, was a small lean-to made of tarps and branches. It looked like someone had been living there for days, maybe weeks. I could see remnants of a fire pit, a few makeshift containers for water, and scraps of food wrappers. Panic rose in my chest. I didn't want to confront whoever this was. I didn't want to fight, and I didn't want to be caught off guard. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to remember every branch, every turn, in case I had to run. When I returned, I found more signs. The footprints on the porch were back, this time deeper, heavier, as if someone had been pacing. My door was still locked, but there were marks on the wood scratches, shallow but deliberate. The fear I'd been trying to suppress became a weight I couldn't ignore. Whoever was here had been watching me. That night, I barricaded the door with the table. I placed chairs behind it, against the wall, and made sure every window was covered. Sleep was impossible. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves, the distant snapping of branches. I kept the bat close, clutching it with sweaty palms. Hours passed. My mind cycled between fear, anger, and disbelief. How could someone live so close without me noticing? What did they want? Did they even know I was here? I sat by the window, watching the shadows, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But I knew better. By the third day, I was running low on food and water. I couldn't stay barricaded forever. I had to face it. Whoever it was, I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, taking only essentials, and prepared to make a run for it. I considered calling the police, but I had no signal, no nearby neighbors, and even if I did, I wasn't sure anyone could reach me quickly. The forest was too dense, the cabin too isolated. I waited until nightfall. Darkness seemed safer. I hoped it would conceal me as I slipped through the trees. I moved slowly, crouched, using the shadows for cover. Every step felt loud, every branch snapped terrifying. My heart pounded in my chest, and then I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, from behind me. I froze, not yelling, not calling my name, just a human sound, close enough to know I wasn't alone. I ran, faster than I had run in years. The forest blurred around me. Branches scratched my arms and face, roots caught my feet, but I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't see the cabin, until the forest felt like it was swallowing me. Only then did I slow down, leaning against a tree, gasping, blood running from a cut on my forehead. Morning came, and with it, a road, a tiny dirt path that eventually led to a larger one, then to the highway. I hitchhiked back to the nearest town, my hands shaking, my clothes torn, my body bruised. I reported the cabin to the local authorities, but by the time they checked it, whoever had been living there was gone. I never went back. The memory of that week, the silence, the isolation, the footsteps on the porch stayed with me. I learned something about fear in those woods. It isn't always supernatural. Sometimes it's just another person, waiting, watching, with their own reasons, their own darkness. And that is enough to make the mountains feel endless, the nights unending, and a small wooden cabin into a prison of terror.